There's a competition on Yapping and your opponent is Dysfunction. Clash of Yapping. What is bro yapping about? The whole video is the yapping never
Bro
ends.
is a master at
Yapping.
bro's just
Never
yapping.
failed
What
to
is
give
the
us
yapping
videos
about
insane.
now?
New yap video dropped. Well, I went through all my videos and found the ones with the most yap comments, and I put them all together for a massive video of me yapping about the history of random things inside of Clash of Clans. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this 1 hour of yap. As the game grows and new tunnels are added, all defenses, troops, and just other buildings all get new levels to keep up. Well, except for the spring traps. They haven't gotten a new level in over 8 years, meaning they've been at the same max level since the beginning of Tunnel 11. But why is this? Why doesn't Clash of Clans add any new levels to the spring traps? Well, that's what we're going to be going over today, so let's get right into it. The first thing we have to look at is the fact that the spring trap just didn't even have any levels at all in the beginning. Back then, the level 1 spring trap could pretty much launch every ground troop in the game, including the P.E.K.K.A, though that ability was removed about a month later. And I mean, other than that, the spring trap really didn't get any significant changes for over 3 years, so what really happened in that time? Well, in its first 3-ish years, the spring trap was just kind of alright. I mean, you unlocked it at Tunnel 4 and it could come in handy for like launching giants, which were a very popular troop at the lower tunnel levels. But other than that, the spring traps were more or less disregarded by the community. They were typically the last thing you would put down when designing your base, and you would kind of just put them either on the outside of the base where people attack from, or bunch them up together along with other traps like the bombs or whatever to kind of just add to a big trap area, typically near the core of the base. And in the earlier days, troll bases were also quite popular, and the spring traps were used fairly often in those. Typically in situations where there would be a hole inside the base and you would just place spring traps and maybe even bombs nearby to catch the enemy off guard. But obviously, as more and more people caught on to these troll bases, this strategy started dying out. And as more and more tunnels were getting added, especially 10 and 11, the spring trap really just seemed to lose purpose in those higher levels because of how weak it was, and also just because things like the golems wouldn't be affected by them, which wasn't good since the golems had more or less replaced the giants, and therefore the spring traps had lost their biggest target in a way and kind of lost their purpose as well. Plus, the fact that the game was transitioning more towards air armies also made the spring traps just even more forgotten and less cared about. So finally, in May of 2016, the spring traps would actually get 4 more levels, so now it could go up to 5, and this was kind of good but also kind of bad. You see, now the spring traps would actually be weaker for the lower levels in the game, since you would have to be Tunnel 10 to max them out at level 5, and the max Tunnel was only level 11, so it was a pretty end game thing. But the good part was that at least now the spring traps did scale with town halls like pretty much every other trap and defense in the game, and this made it somewhat more normal. However, it is hard to ignore the fact that now you actually had to spend time and resources to upgrade the spring traps just for them to do the same, if not worse, things than they had done before the update, depending on what town hall level you were. And it will go on for another 3 years without receiving any changes or any new levels, despite the game being up to town hall 12 now. And obviously, like we all know, the game had been taken over by the Electro Dragons, which really just made the spring traps even more insignificant, and I'm sure there were definitely people that completely even forgot the spring traps existed just because no one was really even using ground armies anymore. And even if they were, then spring traps most likely wouldn't affect them, since they would have things like the normal golems tanking and they wouldn't even notice any troops they lost to the spring traps. But what was even worse was that the spring traps got nerfed when Tunnel 13 came out in December of 2019. Their overall capacity was reduced, with the lower levels getting the biggest of changes, which definitely didn't help them. But they would end up getting 2 buffs in early 2020, with the first one being that the little Yeti mites couldn't trigger the spring traps, which was good I suppose, since Yetis now had a much bigger chance of getting launched by the spring traps, since the Yeti mites couldn't trigger them instead and save the Yeti. And this would be a nerf to the Yetis and buff the spring traps quite a bit, especially because of how popular and strong the Yetis are at Tunnel 13. And the next buff was that their radius got slightly increased, increased, so it was 0.8 tiles instead of 0.7. And I mean, those two buffs would essentially be the final changes that the spring traps would ever get, because since then they haven't received any changes other than the usual upgrade cost and time decreases with new town halls and the addition of a 9th spring trap for Town Hall 13. And speaking of, that is actually what I want to talk about next. While Supercell isn't increasing the levels of the spring traps, they seem to just be adding more to kind of make up for it, and that can be shown since the spring traps have the highest number of placements allowed out of any other defensive building in the game. So while there was a max of only 4 spring traps at the launch of the game, now there are a total of 9, though that number also stopped increasing after Town Hall 13, which I feel is really the point where the spring traps became abandoned. So now that we've gone over the brief history of the spring trap, why doesn't Supercell just add more levels or even change it in any way to make it better? Well, the first issue comes with the spring capacity, since adding more levels would obviously mean you have to increase the spring capacity, and in case you didn't know, the spring capacity is basically the maximum housing space of a troop that it can actually launch. And right now the max capacity is 18, so if they ended up adding more levels, then that number would have to end up being 20 or higher, and that is where the problem lies. You see, the biggest issue is really with the hero pets, which are something you get at Town Hall 13, and that also ended up being the town hall that kind of ended the upgrades to spring traps. All pets have a housing space of 20, even though they don't technically take up any housing space since they aren't part of the army. And the reason for this is really with the activation requirements for the Eagle Artillery, since after you have a certain number of housing space on the field, that is when the Eagle Artillery will activate. And so both the heroes and their pets have a housing space that contributes to the threshold for the Eagle Artillery, even though they don't take up any part of the actual army. So if the spring traps ended up getting more levels, then that means pets would be able to get launched from them, and that is just something that really wouldn't be good for the game in my opinion, and is one of the biggest things holding the spring traps back. So one solution would surely be to just increase the housing space of the pets, but that would make the Eagle Artillery unbalanced and make the game even harder, which isn't really something that is necessary right now in my opinion. The easiest solution would be to just make the pets immune to spring traps, kind of like how the siege machines are immune to them, despite only taking up 1 housing space. But even with this, there's still another problem that is a bit more recent, and that is the fact that the Root Riders also have a 20 housing space. And this is a bit controversial, but making it so spring traps could launch Root Riders may just be a little too OP, since they're most likely to run into spring traps and it could make the game a bit unbalanced. But others also say that the Root Riders are too OP anyways, and therefore this could be a way to nerf and balance them a bit. So I mean, it is all a little complicated, but personally I think there are also other improvements that could be made that don't require the housing space to be increased. The first and biggest one in my opinion could be to add some sort of stun or shock effect in a radius for whenever any troop walks over the trap, and this could be so that any troop over 18 housing spaces gets shocked while ones below that get launched like normal. I think this could be a really cool feature that obviously wouldn't be like too broken, but it would be a good way to make the spring trap more important and give it a purpose and add a new mechanic that could receive changes and upgrades with new levels so that the trap isn't just stuck at level 5 forever. Another possible change is a bit more out there, but it could be to add a floating version or something that just pushes back air troops like an air sweeper. It wouldn't kill them or anything like the normal spring trap, but instead it would just give them one big push, kind of like an air sweeper, and this would be a really good way to incorporate it into the game in my opinion. And it could be that level 6 is when you unlock this ability, and that would make it perfect for like making the Electro Dragon spam a little weaker at Town Hall 11 and up, and will also just make the game a little more interesting. And one final thing that could be really cool would be if you could merge 2 or maybe even like 3 spring traps together to make them either launch more troops or be able to launch higher housing space troops. This would be a bit tricky, but I think it could be balanced since you're combining more than 1 spring trap, which reduces the total number on the field. The air sweeper is only one of 2 defense defenses that were added separately into the game without a new town hall, with the only other one being the bomb tower. The air sweeper has completely changed the game when it comes to air attacks, and today we'll be going over the impact of the air sweeper on Clash of Clans and just why it was so game changing, despite it not having received any new updates in the last 6 years. The air sweeper was added in April of 2015 and there's only one of them, which was unlockable at Town Hall 6. The air sweeper was extremely unique because it was the only defense that didn't do any damage in the game. Instead, it just pushed air troops back with a gust of wind. And while on paper it just seems kind of pointless, the air sweeper will go on to become, in my opinion, the best defense against air troops in the game. And this was an extremely important addition to the game. First of all, you had the air army just absolutely taking over the game past Town Hall 7, with the main ones being the dragons and balloons combo, or the lava hounds and balloons combo. The current defenses in the game just weren't all that strong enough to counter them, and everything just felt a bit weak. So that meant Supercell had to find a way to balance them. So instead of trying to nerf the troops that were super OP or trying to buff the other defenses in the game, they just ended up adding a whole new defense, which ended up being the air sweeper. But in a way, the air sweeper was both a nerf to the air troops and a buff to the defenses, which I think is a genius move by Supercell. It nerfs the air troops because it slows them down and makes them do less damage overall, as they have to spend time making up the lost distance and make up the time in between the attack cooldowns that were disturbed by the air sweepers. And this was also a buff to the defenses as it gave them more time to attack the troops, which let them do even more damage. The air sweepers will be unlocked at Town Hall 6, but it wasn't really until Town Hall 7 that they would really start being useful. And Supercell noticed just how good the air sweepers were and how much of an impact they had, so just 2 months later they added a second air sweeper that could be unlocked at Town Hall 9. And for the last few years, the game has stayed at just 2 air sweepers, which is crazy considering we're at Town Hall 16 now, despite there only being 10 Town Halls when the second air sweeper came out. But another thing that the air sweepers were really good for, that I haven't talked about yet, was with countering the Queen Walk. This strategy was also obviously really popular at the time, and it was even stronger than it is today because back then the healers didn't have as many nerfs to them. But the air sweepers helped nerf it because it would push the healers back, which would add moments where the queen wasn't being healed, and overall this causes her to die quicker and deal less damage. And the second air sweeper at Town Halls 9 and 10 also just helped with this even more, since people had to be more careful when planning their attack, and the same also obviously goes for the air armies as well. The 2 air sweepers added a new element to the game, which obviously made people have to redesign their bases so that the air sweepers would fit in. And there are a ton of different approaches people could take with this. One strategy was towards the outer side of the base to slow down the initial push, but soon enough people had realized that this just wasn't the way to go. And now air sweepers are primarily just put near the town hall or the core of the base. This is because at the core is where there's going to be the most DPS from your defenses, so slowing down the troops over there is the most important place, as that lets the defenses do the most damage. And if someone doesn't plan their attack right, then just a single air sweeper can ruin the attack. People also generally put them near air defenses so that they're able to hit them since they deal the most damage, but you also have to be really careful since people could just lightning spell both the air sweeper and the air defense in one go. So this was riskier, but if someone wasn't using lightning spells, then it could be extremely powerful. And this strategy really just wouldn't change at all over the years, and is still like this to this day. But it would really be around the addition of Town Hall 12 that the air sweepers suddenly became even more important, and that is because of the Electro Dragons. Realistically, it's more of a Town Hall 11 thing, since that's when you can actually unlock them, but it was with the Town Hall 12 update in June of 2018 that the E-Drags were even added to the game. Also, by this point the air sweeper was up to level 7, which is the highest it would ever go even to this day. The air sweeper will be especially effective against the Electro Dragons, which are arguably the most OP/annoying troops in the game. The big downside to them is their slow flying speed and long pauses between attacks, so the air sweepers are really effective against them because they just fly slow in general and they can delay them attacking by a lot because their attacks take so long to charge. So every time they get pushed back, it resets and they have to go through it again, and it can take a few goes before they actually get their attack off. And this is what makes the air sweepers the #1 biggest threat to the Electro Dragons at Town Halls 11 to 12, since people can't just destroy all 4 air defenses with the lightning spells due to them getting reworked. But another troop that I haven't explicitly talked about is the balloons. They're also extremely slow and get affected a ton by the air sweepers, which is also a big reason why the air sweepers are considered so good, because balloons are probably the most key and important troop in a majority of air attacks. One way people try to counter the air sweepers is with haste and raid spells, since both of them increase the movement speed of all troops, and sometimes those are what really make sure balloons can even get past, because otherwise the balloons just wouldn't make it and the attack would be ruined. And past 10 or 12, the overall usage of air troops had declined a little bit, and this is due to numerous reasons that I have talked about in multiple other videos. But one of those reasons is also the air sweeper, but it's a bit more indirect. You see, at the higher town hall levels, you just have so many other defenses and variables, such as the scatter shots, monoliths, spell towers, and I suppose now the new combined defenses at Town Hall 16. These just add so many more things for players to consider compared to the previous Town Halls, where it was really just the air sweepers and air defenses that people had to worry about when it came to the air attacks. So with these new defenses plus the air sweepers, which just enhanced all those other defenses, air armies slowly started drying out higher up. But obviously all the main air armies were still usable, but it just took a lot more skill and planning to actually pull it off. So now that we've talked about pretty much how the air sweepers affected the game, I wanted to actually look into something else about them, and that is the fact that there haven't been any real changes to them in over 6 years. The last update was just them getting level 7, which was only one new level, and the only other change before that was the addition of the second air sweeper, which I talked about earlier. So why isn't Supercell doing anything new with them, considering we've gotten 6 new town halls now? Well, the answer is that the air sweepers are honestly just already too good. I mean, if you look at it from the upgrade point of view, there's only so much more they can add to it before it just becomes way too powerful, either through the range or the force that it pushes the troops away. And a lot of people have also said that Supercell should add a 3rd air sweeper at around the top Town Hall levels, especially with the addition of Town Hall 16. But if they do this, then there will 100% be a new meta where people just put their air sweepers in a triangle formation, which allows them to cover over 70% of the base. And at that point, I think it'll be way more OP than it already is, and will just be horrible for air attacks. So overall, I'd say that the air sweepers have just been perfectly balanced since the day they came out, and they've changed the game for the better by making air attacks harder, since I honestly just can't imagine what the game would be like if the air sweepers just didn't exist, since they are single-handedly the reason that air attacks didn't just fully take over the game. The spell towers are one of the most annoying defenses to deal with inside of Clash of Clans and are something that most players hate. And when they first came out, the spell towers were incredibly broken and people were saying that they were ruining the game, but since then the spell towers have received many changes and have gone through multiple nerfs. So today we'll be going over the history of the spell towers and seeing how they became the most feared defense inside of Clash of Clans. The spell tower was introduced in October of 2022 with the Town Hall 15 update, and it was an extremely unique defense. It was the first of its kind in that it didn't actually shoot anything. All other defenses in the game have some sort of projectile that they shoot at the enemy troops, even the air sweeper, since I'd say the air acts as a projectile. But the spell towers are unique since they didn't shoot anything. Instead, they worked like a normal spell and had a radius around the tower itself where the spell would drop and deal its effects. Plus, it also could reload itself during the match, which is different from other defenses like the Inferno Tower or even the Monolith, since they can't reload during the battle if they end up running out of ammo. And apart from just it being different than the other defenses, it was also arguably one of the most confusing ones to figure out, since each different spell in the tower had their own kind of set of rules when it came to getting deployed and some of the mechanics behind it. Like, the poison spell tower is the only one that actually somewhat gets shot like a projectile, since the spell gets launched towards whatever it is targeting, whereas the other two spell towers drop the spells on themselves and their location will be the same at any time. But if the poison spell tower ends up getting destroyed with the poison spell still active, it will launch it directly onto itself like the other spells. And with each spell having its own activation requirements and radiuses and a bunch of other things, it really made it hard for normal players to try and just learn everything right when the new Town Hall came out. And it really became a thing that only the pro players or just people with a ton of time could really fully learn and be able to apply effectively in battles, and therefore they were the ones that could really enjoy it, while the majority of players were just getting frustrated over the mechanics. And this greatly reduced the number of 3 stars that people were getting at Town Hall 15, since a lot of people really just couldn't figure out the spell towers and the monolith as well that also came with it. Because while normal players weren't that good on the offense, defense wise they could be right up there with the pro players, since all they had to do was just copy the base layout. The spell towers were so unique and different that people were literally making entire different base layouts for each of the spell towers and all the different combinations you could make with them. There were 3 spells: the Rage, Poison, and Invisibility, and that was also the order you unlock them in. Then there were 2 spell towers in total, so that meant by mixing and matching them you could end up with 6 total combinations, which all could be very different from each other in terms of their purpose and how they would affect the attack. But at the beginning, the strongest by far was the double poison combination. If you were at Town Hall 15 around the beginning, or were just at least aware of what was going on, then you would know just how insanely broken and overpowered the double poison meta was. Literally everyone was using it, since you being able to just slow down the movement and attack speed of the enemy troops right in the core of the base was just so strong, and that was, in my opinion, the biggest reason why Town Hall 15 was considered so hard to play. If you wanted to try and counter this, then you had to be very precise with your timings for your troops and spells, and there literally was very little room for error, and that is why it was really a thing that only pro players could really figure out and have fun with, since most other players just didn't find it fun and it was very annoying for them. And because of this, about 2 months later, the poison spell tower received a nerf so that the poison spell would only reduce the attack speed by 25% instead of 35%, but the movement reduction wouldn't be changed. And this may not sound like the biggest of nerfs, but it was a pretty big difference and did make the poison spell used a lot less. This is what let the raid spell towers come into the limelight to replace the poison, and you can kind of say that both of these spells just did the same thing, since the poison spell slowed down the troops and made them less effective, which let the defenses in the core of the base do more damage over time, but the raid spell towers buffed the defenses themselves, and this buff made them do double damage for a whole 18 seconds, which was also really powerful, especially with defenses like the Expo, since they just shot so fast anyways. So their DPS was just crazy. And so the nerf of the poison spell and the effectiveness of the raid spell really just created the double rage meta. And this was basically where people would put their raid spell tower next to some key defenses, so that when the tower activated, some of the most important and powerful defenses would just do double the damage and be insanely hard to defend against. It was because of things like this that really showed how important timing was with things like the warrior ability, or just usage of your own rage or invis spells to try and counter it. And what made it even worse was that sometimes if you weren't quick enough, the rage and even poison towers could activate another one or maybe even 2 times, and if it got to that point, then you were pretty much guaranteed to most likely not even get a 2-star depending on the base and some other factors. Then over time people obviously started to understand the spell towers and develop strategies around them, but that still didn't change the fact of just how strong they were, and this led to another nerf of the spell towers in June of 2023. The raid spell got 2 nerfs, with the first being that it now boosted the damage by 90% instead of 100%, and the second nerf was that the reload time was increased by a whole 20 seconds, and the poison and invis spells reload time was also raised by 10 seconds. This was quite a big difference, and while this was enough to rule out the double poison strategy, the double rage was still strong since it was like the only good one left. And I know there is the invis spell tower that I haven't really talked about, but that tower had really just been the trickiest one in my opinion to figure out and use effectively a majority of times. So that makes it hard to kind of build a base around, and it is really just more of like a special case spell that only some people use in specific cases, and it has never really been all that popular or super strong, so I don't really think it matters too much. Personally, I'd say the invis towers were just more annoying than actually strong. But if you fast forward to just the end of 2023 during the World Finals, you can actually see the stats of the usage of the spell towers, and the double rage combo is by far the most popular, with the next two just being a combo of the rage with invis and poison, with the double poison only being used 1 out of 100 times, and this really shows just how much better the rage spell tower was than the other ones. And from the release of the spell towers all the way up to this point, the whole time the spell towers were getting a ton of hate from the community because of how strong they were. I mean, if you looked on Reddit, there would be a ton of posts complaining about the spell towers and how they were just catering towards the pro players, and how Supercell didn't care about the casual player base, and I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. But there definitely was a bit of truth to this, since the difference between attacking at Town of 14 and 15 was pretty big. I mean, Town of 15 was way harder, and it has been pretty controversial about whether or not that was good for the game, but personally I don't think it was, but I definitely understand the other argument. But about 2 months ago, Town of 16 came out, and this also brought some changes with the spell towers, mainly just a rage one, because it got another nerf where its radius was reduced, where it could rage other defenses, meaning in most cases people weren't able to rage as many defenses as before, and this has made an impact. This has kind of brought the poison spells back, but there is still a healthy mix of the rage spells and even the invisibility spells being used. Right now, I'd say the game is at its most balanced state when it comes to the spell towers, since there isn't an overwhelming majority like there was in the past with the double poison and double rage metas. And through all of these various nerfs, the spell towers of all kinds are definitely not as OP or broken as they once were when they got released, and therefore are a lot more liked by the community now. But that still doesn't change the fact that they are still difficult to attack, and many people still fear the spell towers in super well built bases, especially in clan wars where the stakes are a lot higher. And overall, just the whole complexity and strength of the spell towers is really what made them arguably the most feared defense inside of Clash of Clans, and is the reason they have just continued to receive nerfs and have never gotten a buff. The hidden Tesla is no doubt a very important defense inside of Clash of Clans, but it had also become one of the biggest trolls in the game, especially with the corner Tesla. And today we're going to be going over the hidden Tesla, how it became such a troll, and how it also became one of the most important defenses inside of the entire game. The hidden Tesla was added just 4 weeks after the game came out, and it was really unique since it acted like a trap because it was hidden, but it wasn't actually classified as one. Unlike all the other traps in the game currently, the hidden Tesla wasn't just a one-time thing. Instead, it would act like a normal defense after coming out of the ground, and that's probably why it is classified as a defense. This is what would essentially allow people to troll with it, and also the same thing that would make it one of the most important defenses in the game, but we'll get to that part later. You first unlock the hidden Tesla at Town Hall 7, and you unlocked 2 of them. At this stage of the game, just 2 Teslas wouldn't make too big of a difference defensively if they were put in the base itself, because they didn't do a ton of damage or anything and were pretty easy to destroy. Obviously, there would be situations where a troop was at very low HP and the hidden Tesla was enough to kill it, but that was rare and so people didn't really focus on it. Instead, they would just put their Teslas in the corners of their base, and this kind of worked like how you put the builder huts in the corner, but with the Teslas, the enemy wouldn't actually see them unless it deployed troops in the corner, which pretty much no one does, or until they had done 51% destruction to the base, since all hidden Teslas will automatically pop out after that point. Also, by that point, in most cases, the enemy would have deployed all of their troops, meaning they couldn't do anything about the Teslas now. And if you put your Teslas on opposite corners of the base, then that could literally mean over a minute of traveling for the enemy troops to go to both of them, assuming they were all together. And this would cause them to not get the 3 stars because they ran out of time. And this was probably the biggest way of trolling with the hidden Teslas, and it was quite effective. And the other thing that made this strat so good was that it really messed up defense targeting troops, such as hog riders and balloons, which were also some of the strongest and most used troops in the game at this time and at that town hall level. Typically, you would only have some hog riders or balloons alive by the end of your attack depending on your strategy, and so that meant those troops would go for the hidden Teslas first instead of getting rid of any non-defense buildings in the base, and this would cause them to take up even more time, and in most situations like this, the attacker would definitely run out of time, especially with balloons considering how slow they already are. And this was made even worse if the town hall was one of the non-defensive buildings, as that meant the attacker only got a 1 star instead of a 2 star, and that was really the peak troll of this whole strategy. But it also wasn't just limited to town hall 7. People would even do it for town halls 8, 9, 10, and maybe 11. But at that point, the hidden Teslas had become more important as actual defenses. And this tactic was also kind of buffed and nerfed in a way with the addition of 10 or 11, since that update increased the size of the map, meaning it was obviously bigger, and that meant the travel time between the corner Teslas would be longer, but the overall battle time had also increased, so it was kind of like both a buff and a nerf. And it would really just depend on how long it took the attacker to destroy the base before being left with the Teslas. And over the last few years, this strategy has kind of died out since people progressed through the early town halls so much faster, so it isn't really a priority to try and prevent people from getting 3 stars on anything, when it might only take you a few weeks to move from like town hall 7 to 10 compared to the earlier days where it would take many months. Plus, past like town hall 10 or 11, they just take up so much space that they can cover the entire map, and so some hidden Teslas in the corner just wouldn't make sense either for the purpose of preventing a 3 star. But back then, this strategy was so popular and so widely used that strategies were being formed just around them. The biggest and probably most basic was just having like 4 barbarians or other small troops and putting them at the 4 corners to test for these Teslas. And if they existed, then you could destroy it with your other troops. But another strategy was to keep some stronger troops on standby until you either just woke up the hidden Teslas or until you could see where they were after 50% damage. And if they were at the corners, then you could use those troops you were holding and deploy them to take care of the hidden Teslas. So that is also one factor that led to the strategy dying out, since it had relied on people not knowing about it and it being a surprise. So when it became widely well known, people started using it less. And when the builder base got added, this strategy also briefly came back since the builder base map was pretty big compared to the actual structures you could build, so it was pretty effective here, especially because the time really mattered in the head-to-head attacking style, and putting the hidden Tesla in a corner could really be the difference between a win and a loss for you. So it had made a bit of a comeback, but obviously now with the builder base 2.0 changes and just the overall decline of the builder base, it really isn't even that important over there anymore. But even outside of this troll, the hidden Teslas had more ways people could troll using them, and that was with farming bases. And one of those was with farming bases. And this was only possible before 10 or 11 came out, since that update kind of ruined the strategy. And I talk more about that in this video if you want to check it out, but basically it was a fairly common thing back then for people to just leave their town hall in the corner of their base completely unprotected so that the enemy would just destroy that and move on. And the purpose of this was to save loot. And because it was a popular strategy, some people started trolling by making it a trap, essentially where they would place the hidden Teslas and their traps around the town hall to hopefully get people by surprise. And this was kind of controversial as some people saw it as really scummy, while others just saw it as something funny that didn't really matter too much. And I find a way people used to troll with the hidden Teslas, and what still does happen to this day, is creating fake spawn points inside of your base. Now, Now, this is definitely a tactic for the lower town halls, and it is also used with the other traps in the game, but this tactic was basically just creating a wide enough gap in your base so that enemies could spawn inside, and it would seem safe, but once they spawned, they would trigger whatever traps or hidden Teslas may have been there, and it was a good way to troll unsuspecting players. And obviously, like with putting it in the corner, people soon realized the strategy and fell for it less. But if someone managed to make it look like a hole was there by mistake, or they just put so many holes that it would be impossible to guess where the traps were, then it could still be pretty effective. Either way, all of these things really made the hidden Teslas really good to use for trolling in the game, and despite them not always being used to deal damage, they were still pretty good at preventing 3 stars, which was the most important part. But after about 2016 or 2017ish, the hidden Tesla trolling was definitely not as popular, but now it was being seen as a defense that could actually really be useful with defending, and this primarily came in the form of the Tesla farm. This was basically just where you put all of your hidden Teslas right next to each other so that they could all do a ton of damage combined, and it was like a trap since it was supposed to surprise the attacker and throw off their attack. And despite there being 4 hidden Teslas at Town Hall 9, this was more of a strategy that was used at Town Hall 10 and onwards. This is because you now had enough walls and buildings and stuff to space things out and have a couple of spots for a Tesla farm, meaning the attacker couldn't be 100% sure of where it was. Though some bases made it pretty obvious, but that was to be expected once people started figuring out the strategy, similar to how they reacted after figuring out the corner Tesla strat. However, some people would put up bases like this, yet not put the farm in the obvious spot, so you could never really be 100% certain, since some people also just didn't even use a farm at all. However, the Tesla farm strategy would be really strong, mainly against air armies like the dragons and balloons, since it is no secret that air defenses are pretty lackluster until about Town Halls 13 or 14. So having a bunch of hidden Teslas was a really good way to deal with air attacks, especially when you put a ton of air traps nearby to help also deal a ton of damage. And even around Town Hall 7 and 8, you could argue that the Teslas were super important since they were one of the few defenses that could also hit air troops, which was essential considering how strong dragons and balloons were at those levels and how ineffective other defenses were at stopping them. But they were also a bit too strong to the point where those 2 or 3 Teslas really couldn't do much, which is why people used them for the other troll purposes that I mentioned earlier. But back to the higher town halls. The Tesla farm would end up being an extremely effective defense, especially when you put it near the town hall. And Town Hall 12 itself also kind of acted like a Tesla, so that was just even more combined damage. And it could really destroy an army at the core of your base if you designed your base correctly. And obviously, past Town Hall 12, all town halls were also weaponized, which just made putting a bunch of Teslas around it a lot stronger, since the whole appeal of the Tesla is that they don't take up much space and you can use them to just add more DPS without sacrificing much. And around like Town Halls 14 and 15, the Tesla farm would also be pretty effective against the miner and hog rider hybrid strategy because the Teslas are good at getting swarms of troops, since it is 5 separate defenses all attacking at the same time, so they were able to deal quite a bit of damage to those troops. And you could even put bombs around the Teslas since both of those troops are melee troops, meaning they have to get right next to Teslas to attack them. And adding a giant bomb around them would really help deal a ton of damage very fast to large groups of these troops. And at Town Hall 16, they still play a pretty similar role. So overall, the Teslas that used to be used as more of a troll at the lower town halls ended up transforming into one of the most important defenses inside of the game at the higher town halls. And this wasn't because the Tesla itself was strong, it's more because the group of them together are really strong and can do a ton of DPS together. And it has been really cool to watch the transformation of this defense as something overlooked by many to becoming a key part of your defense, protecting the most important structure in your base, which is the town hall. The air defense is the only defense in the game designed specifically to combat air troops, but it just might be one of the most useless ones. And this has made it possibly one of the most hated defenses in the game, and today we're going to be going over the history of it to see how it ended up in this position. The air defense was one of the original defenses in the game, and it was unlockable at Town Hall 4, which was also the town town hall in which you unlocked your first air troop, which was the balloon. And at this point in the game, the only other defense that could shoot the balloon was the archer tower. So in total, there's only one air defense and 2 archer towers that could damage the balloons, and obviously none of them were really enough to stop the balloons, and it was basically just a guaranteed 3-star if you used an all balloon army because of the lack of counters to air armies at Town Hall 4. So right when you unlock them, the air defenses already proved to be useless when faced against the balloons, and many people are saying that they should either be buffed or you should unlock 2 of them so that it is much more balanced and more fair. But either way, as you move up to Town Hall 5, it is actually a lot better. You still only have 1 air defense, but now you get another archer tower and you unlock the wizard tower and 2 air bombs, which are both very useful against air troops, which at this stage is still mainly just the balloons. And the air defense is typically put in the middle of the base and is surrounded by other defenses because this lets the air defense actually be able to do some good damage before getting destroyed, unlike at Town Hall 4 where the balloons don't really have to get through much to get to the air defense. So this all makes it actually pretty useful because without it, air attacks will be a lot stronger. And it is probably the reason that barely any people use the balloons at Town Hall 5. Instead, they just go with the ground armies like the Giants and Wizards combo. And it is more or less the same at Town Hall 6 as well, except that you unlock a second air defense, which just helps deter people from using air troops. And at Town Hall 6, you also did unlock your second air troop, which was the healer. But unfortunately, everything was downhill after this for the air defense, and that is because of the dragons, which you unlocked at Town Hall 7. The dragons are the most broken and most overpowered troops at this town hall, especially when paired up with the balloons. And if you pair both of them up with raid spells, then they just move so fast through the base that the air defenses or any other defenses just don't have a chance to really even stop them. Despite you now having 3 air defenses, they just end up proving useless against the dragon and raid spell combination. Plus, the dragons are also pretty tanky, so just one can be enough to tank for the rest of the dragons and can buy enough time to get rid of all of the air defenses. And most of the time, you really just don't even notice the air defenses, and it wouldn't make too big of an impact on the outcome of the battle whether the air defenses were there or not. The only real kind of threat to the dragons and balloons at Town Hall 7 is the air sweeper, which was added specifically to combat this overpowered strategy. And while it did help, it just wasn't effective enough since there was only one and you could just attack from the opposite side. But outside the dragons, this town hall also introduced another factor that really made the air defenses seem useless, and those were the lightning spells. Now, I know you obviously unlocked lightning spells way before this, but it is at Town Hall 7 that you really saw the strategy start being used, and that was a strategy to just completely destroy air defenses using the lightning spells. It takes 4 spells to destroy 1 air defense at this stage, but if there are 2 air defenses closer to each other, then you can destroy 2 for the price of 1. And this is something that was actually only made possible because of a rework to the lightning spells in June of 2020. And this rework basically made the lightning spell only 1 zap in a smaller radius instead of multiple zaps in a larger radius. And this allowed it to be much more precise and reliable to use, and what guaranteed you always did the full damage to the target you wanted. And at the later town halls, you'll see the strategy just become even stronger and more OP, and what ultimately made the air defenses essentially useless, but we'll get to that later on. For now, let's move on to Town Hall 8. This town hall was also very similar to Town Hall 7 in that the dragons and balloons were absolutely dominating and that the air defenses were not. So there really isn't much to be said here, so let's move on to Town Hall 9. And here is where you will get your 4th air defense, which would end up being your last one. But you would also unlock the Lava Hound, which was a troop that was meant to directly counter the air defense. And it is also the only troop in the game that targets a specific defense, which also contributes to the hate for the air defense since there is literally a troop built just to counter it. The Lava Hound is very tanky and is basically a Sky Golem, and it is a crucial part in the Lava Loon strategy, which is arguably the most powerful air army in the game. So now there was a troop that you could send directly to the air defenses, and it will take them long enough for the balloons to get there and destroy them. So basically the air defenses were just kind of useless since they were attacking a troop that barely did any damage to them, and they couldn't deal damage to the troops that actually mattered, which were the balloons. So the balloons paired up with the haste and raid spells were really just able to destroy any base regardless of the air defenses in their strategy, since the lava hounds obviously took care of them. And so Town 9 became another pivotal point in the game for the decline of the air defense, but moving on to Town 10, it was kind of similar to Town 9 except for the fact that Inferno Towers were now in the game, and these will turn out to be so much more useful against air troops, which made the actual air defenses just seem even worse. As everyone knows, the Inferno Towers have two modes, with the first one being the single target mode. This just sends out one beam which compounds the damage, so the longer it is on a troop, the more damage it will do. And this was really good against the dragons since, well, they were really strong at this town hall level too. And the other mode was multi-target, and this was obviously really good for the balloons since they didn't have much health and usually traveled in groups, so a multi-target inferno paired with an air mine was a deadly combo, and something way more effective than the air defense. And this made many people dislike the air defense since other defenses were now being proven to be more effective at killing air troops than the thing literally designed for it. I mean, even the expos were arguably better than the air defenses in some regard, especially with them next to each other all targeting a single troop. But what I think really kind of rubbed it in was the air sweeper, since it didn't do any damage at all, yet it was way more effective than the air defenses and made a much bigger impact on the game. And this all made players really just wonder what Supercell was doing with the air defense, since it only targeted air troops and was called the air defense, meaning that it was supposed to defend the base from air troops, yet it seemed to be very bad at it. And there was also the fact that the air troops were way stronger than the ground troops for the most part, so it seemed like an obvious move to buff the air defenses, but Supercell just never did, and it made players mad because their defense logs were just full of air attacks. And this would become even worse at Town Hall 11 since that is when you unlock the Electro Dragons. And I think we all know just how strong the Electro Dragon is. In fact, Clash of Clans even recently made a meme about it on their Twitter page. And while we're on that topic, you should also consider dropping me a follow on Twitter, as I'll try to be more active on there and do some more giveaways soon. But back to the Electro Dragons. This was pretty similar to unlocking the normal dragons at Town Hall 7 in terms of how they just completely took over the game and how they were so overpowered, especially with the lightning spells. I know I mentioned them earlier and how it took 4 to destroy an air defense, but now with how things scaled, it only took 3 lightning spells to destroy 1 air defense, and that meant it would take 12 to destroy all 4. And with the help of your clan castle, you were able to get enough lightning spells to literally destroy all 4 air defenses, completely taking them out of the equation. And now you were able to focus on things like the Eagle Artillery and Inferno Towers, which were the main defenses you had to worry about after the air defenses. And this was also made easier with the addition of the siege machines, mainly the log launcher, as you could destroy at least 1 Inferno Tower before getting to the Town Hall, which was really helpful. Plus, if you could destroy an air sweeper along with the lightning spells or siege machine, then that would just be a bonus and would make the attack just so much easier. And Town Hall 12 was pretty much just the identical situation to Town Hall 11, except that the Town Hall itself was also able to fight back, and was actually pretty effective against the air troops as well, but just not strong enough to actually make too big of a difference. But as for the air defenses, they were still pretty useless, as you could still just lightning spell all of them, and that would remain true for every single Town Hall in the game, including Town Hall 16. But Town Hall 13 introduced the scatter shot, and was also probably the last Town Hall in the whole reign of terror of the Electro Dragons. And I mean, the Electro Dragons can still be very good past Town Hall 13, but they usually require a lot more skill and a more complex army to use, so you would end up seeing a bit of a decrease in their usage as people tended to kind of go back towards ground troops. And a reason for this was the scatter shot, which was unlocked at Town Hall 13, but it will get stronger and be even better at Town Hall 14 and higher. And once again, this was another situation where another defense was more dangerous against air troops than the air defense itself. And as you unlocked other defenses like the monolith and spell towers, you realized just how much more important they were than the air defenses when it came to protecting against air troops. And this kind of makes you wonder why you bother upgrading them at all. And this is really just where it gets interesting. And it's kind of the same problem with the walls, which I explain a lot more in this video. But basically, the situation is that if you don't upgrade your air defenses, then people will just attack you anyways, but instead of maybe using lightning spells on the air defenses, they will use them on the air sweepers or inferno towers or something, which obviously isn't good for you. But if you were to upgrade the air defenses, then chances are people will just destroy them anyways with lightning spells or with a lava loon strategy or something, and it will basically have done nothing to protect your base. But the air defenses do prove to be more important past like Town Hall 14, so if you skip out on upgrading them in the earlier town halls, then you're going to regret it at the higher town halls, and you obviously don't want to waste a bunch of time upgrading all of your air defenses a bunch once you get to that point. And all of this really just makes the air defense one of the most annoying things to deal with, and is why many people have a strong dislike for them. The most obvious way to change this would be by either just adding like one more air defense in, or making them stronger, mainly in their health so that you can't just lightning spell all of them so easily. But unfortunately, Supercell really haven't done much to try and make the air defenses better, and that is partly a reason why the air troops are so popular in the game, especially the Electro Dragon. The builder base was introduced to Clash of Clans almost 7 years ago, and it was arguably the biggest change the game had received up until that point, since a whole new base was literally added into the game. However, the history of the builder base has been rocky at best, with tons of controversy around it, and today we're going to be going over just how it became so problematic in the game and how it divided many players. The builder base was added in May of 2017, and it originally came out with just 5 builder hall levels, though there were up to 8 in the game files, so people knew that it was going to expand and get bigger soon. And initially, the builder base was a success and people really liked it because it was something really new and kind of a throwback to the early stages of the game, since a lot of the things in the builder base were obviously similar to the normal home village. Plus, it also had somewhat new troops, though most of them initially were just altered versions of the troop in the home village. And that kind of showed a new side to them and made them more interesting to play around with. And the similar was also done with the buildings and defenses, which are both similar and different from their home village counterparts in some ways. But the biggest and most interesting part of the new builder base was the head-to-head battles. This was a really cool feature where you and an opponent would directly compete with each other in real time to deal the most amount of damage in the shortest period of time. Plus, you didn't have to wait for any troops to train or even pay for them or anything, since you could pick your army while you were scouting. And people really liked the whole fast-paced and spontaneous approach to this. And at the beginning, you will basically be paired up with an opponent instantly due to the large number of players playing, but this would end up changing for the worse as time went on, but we'll get to that in a bit. But overall, the builder base became a really cool side project for players to work on, and it was something to do while they were waiting for their armies to train in the home village, since those obviously still took time. Plus, it also added the gem mine, and while they obviously didn't give like a ton of gems, it was still a really cool thing to be in the game and something that tons of players had been wanting for years, and it had kind of become a joke since no one actually thought Supercell would add a legit gem mine. But they ended up doing it, and it was just really cool to see. And for the first few months of its existence, the builder base was pretty liked by the majority of players, since there wasn't really anything to complain about. It didn't interfere with your home village and just gave you some more stuff to do for fun on the side. The builder base didn't really have any sort of purpose that would motivate you to play it, other than the fact that it was just a cool thing and the versus battles were fun. So because of this, despite people liking it, the popularity slowly started to decrease as players did eventually get bored of it, and not even new builder hall levels were really enough to get people to bother playing again. so Supercell obviously had to change things up. So around March of 2018, Supercell added the gear ups to link the builder base to the home village. Gearing up a defense typically made it stronger for the most part and was definitely something that was worth doing since it made your home village stronger. And the way to gear up defenses in your home village was to upgrade the defenses in your builder base to a certain level to unlock the gear up option. And once you were ready, the master builder would travel from the builder base to the home village to do the gear up. This would make people play the builder base again, but there was a slight difference. This time, people felt as if they were kind of just forced to play in order to progress. Obviously, there were a ton of players that were happy to play the builder base now because it will make sense devoting some of their time and energy into it for an actual reward, but other players didn't feel the same way. The biggest thing that kind of made players start to dislike the builder base was the loot cap, since you could only get loot for a limited amount of attacks per day, and therefore the loot was throttled, which forced players to play the builder base over a longer period of time, which they obviously didn't like. The only other way to get the resources was to buy it, and obviously most players didn't want to do that, and it even brought some pay to win allegations. But overall, the requirements for gear ups weren't that high, and most people just kind of accepted it and grinded for the gear ups, and then just moved on. And while grinding for the gear ups, some players realized they actually liked the builder base and just continued playing, which was obviously good for them and good for Supercell since that's what they wanted. And a little over a year later, they also added the auto builder hut, which was arguably the biggest and most important thing to come out of the whole builder base. Auto meant that now you could basically have a 6th builder for your home village, since it would allow the master builder to travel to the home village, which was a feature introduced with the gear ups. But the 6th builder could literally save months in total upgrade time to max out your base or just to progress a lot faster. And the 6th builder was something that everyone wanted, and the way to get it was to obviously build up your builder base and upgrade certain things to certain levels, which were quite high and actually took a decent amount of time. And it was definitely more of a grind than the gear ups, and it will take a while for most players to unlock auto if they had stopped playing around the point of the gear ups, which was a majority of the player base. And once again, the whole limited loot every day was becoming a problem again, since now people needed way more resources and just trying to use runes wasn't really enough. The loot issue would essentially be one of the two massive problems that ended up leading to the whole rework of the builder base in the future. The second problem was actually with matchmaking, and this was mainly at Builder Hall 9, which also came out in the same update with the auto builder hut. Most people didn't even bother going past the requirements for the auto hut, so even less players went all the way up to Builder Hall 9, which was honestly just such a grind to get to, especially if you were completely free to play. And the lack of players at such a high level obviously brought issues with matchmaking, since it all depended on you finding someone else in real time who was at the same level as you and also searching for a battle. And in some cases, people could be searching for several minutes, possibly even an hour to find any opponent. And this was clearly a massive problem since attacking was the main way to get loot, and you couldn't rely on just your collectors since they gave very little. But even outside of the resources, the attacking in general was really the whole fun and appeal of the builder base, so if players couldn't even do that, then that made the builder base even less fun for the people that really liked it. And this was a problem that was kind of going on for years, sometimes more extreme than other times. But overall, it was still enough to lower the quality of the game for most people at that level, which was sometimes enough to even make them quit. And paired up with all the people just quitting as soon as they got the 6th builder, the builder base was going downhill pretty fast, and it was just seen as a chore and grind for most players instead of something fun to play along with the home village. And all of this is the reason why Supercell just completely revamped the builder base and launched a 2.0 version in May of 2023, almost exactly 6 years after the initial launch of the builder base. And the new 2.0 update was very interesting and controversial to say the least. They got rid of the versus battles, which was the main unique part of the builder base, but it had also become one of the biggest problems, so it was overall just a weird situation. But to kind of replace the uniqueness of the versus battles, they split the builder base into two separate sections, which was supposed to make the text a lot more interesting and would require a lot more thinking. And while these two things weren't exactly bad, they definitely did feel a bit weird, but I don't think many people could really complain about it since it was new and interesting. But what is personally my least favorite thing is how they basically limited the troops so much in their quantity and made it so you basically only had one or a couple of a certain troop in a slot. And the troops also now had special abilities, kind of like the heroes, but in many cases these abilities really weren't all that special and definitely didn't make up for the lack of troops. This made the attacks more boring and kind of stale, especially because now there were really only two main troops that were good, which were the baby dragons and P.E.K.K.A.s. A lot of the other troops were just so bad to the point where they were like completely useless and not worth it at all to take up a slot. But this is just a bit more of a personal preference since I know other people absolutely love the lower amount of troops. So as for some of the other changes, they actually did kind of fix the loot system so that you weren't limited in the amount you could earn anymore, though this also brought in its own issues. First of all, how the new system worked was that you would get gold from every attack, and for every attack you would also get one defense, which is how you got elixir. So they kind of tried to incorporate some Legends League type features into the builder base, but essentially every attack got you a little bit of gold and elixir. But the majority of your loot would come from the star bonus, which was 9 in this case because you could get 6 stars from one attack, meaning you needed a minimum of 2 attacks to get the bonus, which was honestly pretty easy. And the star bonus would give you a pretty big chunk of loot, which was nice, but it was also limited per day. So personally, I think if they just doubled or maybe even tripled the normal loot you get after every attack, it would be a lot better and so much more balanced. But the new system is still better than the old one in my opinion. But outside of this, the auto hut got removed and changed to Bob control, and the requirements were changed, but it was more or less the same amount of effort, so it wasn't too big of a deal. And other than that, there wasn't really much else that was too notable. Overall, it was an improvement from the original builder base in my opinion, and it definitely helped reignite the flame for motivation to play the builder base. But at the end, it overall had the same problem with people only playing it for the benefits and just quitting. And that's why I think the builder base is so problematic. It is quite essential for progression in your home village, but people just feel like they're forced to play the builder base when they don't want to, and that just makes them hate it even more. And it just creates a toxic relationship in a way, since people need to play until they get the 6th builder, and after that they just quit and might literally never come back except to collect gems or complete challenges in the clan games. The builder base has just always had problems with fitting into the game, and it has really felt forced on Supercell's part to try and get us to like it, but not many people really do, yet they're forced to play it, and that's what makes it so problematic and so hated.